Margaret had worked at Hammond and Price for 17 years. Not 16. Not 15. 17. She knew because she'd counted every single one during the last board meeting, when David Hammond stood at the front of the glass conference room and announced the new vice president of client relations. It wasn't her. The room had gone quiet in that specific way rooms do when everyone knows something uncomfortable is happening. Margaret sat 3 seats from the end, hands folded on the table, looking at a water ring someone's coffee cup had left on the wood. "We're thrilled to announce," David said, smiling wide, "that Brandon Collar will be stepping into this leadership role. Before we continue, if this is your first time watching one of our videos, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and comment where you are watching from. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us bring you even more powerful stories." Brandon was 29. He'd been with the company for 4 years. Margaret had trained him. She'd taught him how to read client files, how to follow up without being pushy, how to close deals that seemed impossible. She'd stayed late with him during his first year when he panicked before a presentation. She'd walked him through every step, and now he was her boss. "Let's give Brandon a round of applause," David said. The room clapped. Margaret clapped too. She didn't know what else to do. Brandon looked at her once, just a glance, and then looked away. His face said nothing. No guilt. No surprise. Just blank. After the meeting, people shuffled out quickly. No one came to her desk. No one said, "I'm sorry, Margaret." No one said, "That should have been you." She sat there for 20 minutes, staring at her computer screen, feeling like she'd become invisible. That night, she went home to her small apartment and made tea she didn't drink. She sat on the couch and stared at the wall. And she thought, when did I disappear? 2 weeks later, the company held a celebratory lunch. It was at Marcello's, a downtown restaurant with white tablecloths and waiters in black vests. The kind of place that made you feel like you were supposed to be someone important. Margaret almost didn't go. But she told herself, "You've been here 17 years. You belong here." She arrived 10 minutes early, wearing a navy blazer she'd ironed that morning. The tables were already filling up. She saw Brandon near the center, laughing with the marketing team. David Hammond stood at the head, holding a glass of wine, talking loudly about quarterly projections. Margaret walked toward an empty seat near the middle. Just as she reached for the chair, someone's hand touched her shoulder. It was Jessica, one of the junior account managers. "Oh, Margaret," Jessica said, voice sweet but firm. "That seat's saved." Margaret blinked. "Saved? Yeah. We're keeping it for Vanessa from the LA office. She's flying in today." Margaret looked at the table. There were 2 other empty chairs farther down, near the end. Near the corner where the lighting was dim and the conversations didn't reach. "Right," Margaret said quietly. "Of course." She moved to the end of the table. No one looked at her. She sat down, smoothed her napkin over her lap, and stared at the menu even though she wasn't hungry. Lunch started. David stood and gave a toast. "To Brandon," he said, raising his glass. "For his vision, his leadership, and his future with this company." Everyone raised their glasses. Margaret raised hers too. Brandon smiled and nodded, soaking it all in. Then David said something that made Margaret's stomach twist. "You know," David continued, "Brandon reminds me of myself when I was young. Hungry. Willing to take risks. That's what we need. Not people who just coast." The word hung in the air. Coast. Margaret's hand tightened around her glass. She knew exactly who he meant. The rest of lunch blurred. People laughed. Plates came and went. Someone ordered champagne. Margaret ate 3 bites of salmon and excused herself early. No one noticed. She walked out of the restaurant into the afternoon sun, and for the first time in 17 years, she thought, "I don't want to go back." Margaret didn't quit. She thought about it, but she didn't. Instead, she did something quiet. She stopped trying. Not in an obvious way. She still showed up, still answered emails, still attended meetings, but she stopped staying late. She stopped volunteering for extra projects. She stopped mentoring the new hires. She stopped caring. And strangely, no one seemed to notice. 3 weeks passed. Then 4. Then 8. Margaret moved through the office like a shadow. She sat at her desk, completed her tasks, and left at 5 o'clock sharp. Brandon, meanwhile, was everywhere. He gave presentations. He shook hands with clients. He sent company-wide emails about new initiatives and streamlining processes. But something started happening. Small things at first. A client called, confused about a contract change Brandon had made. Margaret had to quietly fix it. Then another client complained that Brandon hadn't followed up on a major pitch. Margaret stepped in, smoothed it over, and closed the deal herself, without telling anyone. Then a third client, one of the firm's oldest, sent a formal email to David Hammond asking where Margaret was. "She's the only one who understands our account," the email read. "We haven't heard from her in 2 months. Is she still with the company?" David forwarded the email to Brandon with a single line. "Handle this." Brandon didn't. He forgot. And the client pulled a $200,000 contract. That's when things started to shift. David called a meeting. Brandon sat at the front, looking confident. Margaret sat in her usual spot near the back. "We've had some issues," David said carefully. "With client retention." Brandon nodded. "I'm aware. I'm working on a new outreach strategy." "That's not what I'm asking for," David interrupted. The room went still. "I'm asking why 3 of our top clients have gone quiet in the last 2 months. And why 2 of them specifically asked for Margaret." Brandon's face changed. Just slightly. But Margaret saw it. David turned and looked directly at her. "Margaret," he said, "what's your read on this?" Everyone turned. For the first time in months, she was seen. Margaret met David's eyes. And she said very calmly, "I think they're wondering where the person who actually built those relationships went." Silence. David stared at her. Brandon shifted in his seat. Margaret didn't look away. 2 days later, Margaret received an email. It was from David Hammond. Subject line, "Meeting request urgent." She stared at it for a long moment before opening it. "Margaret, I'd like to meet with you tomorrow at 9 a.m. in my office. Just the 2 of us." "David." She didn't reply. She just showed up. David's office was on the top floor, all glass walls and leather chairs. He gestured for her to sit. "Margaret," he began, folding his hands on the desk. "I'll be direct. We're losing clients. And the feedback we're getting is troubling." Margaret said nothing. "They're saying they don't feel valued anymore. That communication has dropped off. That promises aren't being kept." He paused. "And they're all asking for you." Margaret looked at him. "So I need to ask," David said quietly. "What happened? You used to be everywhere. Now you're—" He trailed off. "Coasting." Margaret finished. David flinched. She let the silence sit. Then she spoke. "I spent 17 years building relationships with those clients. I learned their businesses. I remembered their kids' names. I sent birthday cards. I stayed late to fix their problems. I made them feel like they mattered." Her voice was calm, steady. "And when it came time to recognize that work, you gave my job to someone who didn't do any of it." David opened his mouth. Margaret continued. "So I stopped. I stopped doing the extra things. The things that weren't in my job description. The things that made this company look good." She leaned forward slightly. "And now you're seeing what happens when I'm not holding it all together." David stared at her. For a long time he didn't speak. Then he said very quietly, "What do you want?" Margaret stood. "I want you to fix it yourself." And she walked out. Word travels fast in a small company. By the end of the week, people knew Margaret had met with David. They didn't know what was said, but they knew something had shifted. Brandon started looking nervous. He sent Margaret 2 emails asking for her help with client files. She didn't respond. Then one Friday afternoon, something happened that no one expected. One of the firm's largest clients, Garrett Industrial, a $500,000 account, sent an email to the entire executive team. The subject line read, "Formal complaint." The email was short. "We have been working with Hammond and Price for 9 years. In that time, Margaret Collier has been our primary contact. She has been professional, reliable, and trustworthy. In the last 3 months, we have been reassigned to Brandon Collar. We have not received timely responses. Our concerns have been ignored. Our contract renewal is due next month. If Margaret Collier is not reinstated as our account manager, we will not be renewing. The email copied 12 people, including Brandon. Within an hour, 2 other clients sent similar emails. By Monday morning, the damage was undeniable. David called an emergency meeting. This time, Margaret wasn't in the back. She was asked to sit at the table. David stood at the front, looking tired. "There's been a miscalculation," he said slowly, "in how we've structured our client services team." Brandon sat stiffly, staring at the table. "We're making some changes," David continued. "Effective immediately, Margaret Collier will resume her role as Senior Client Relations Manager. She will oversee all major accounts." People glanced at each other. Margaret didn't react. David hesitated, then added, "Brandon will transition into a support role under Margaret's leadership." The room went silent. Brandon's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. After the meeting, no one approached Margaret. But as she walked back to her desk, she heard whispers, saw glances, felt the shift. She sat down, opened her email, and for the first time in months, she smiled. Not because she'd won, but because she'd been seen. Margaret didn't gloat. She didn't make speeches. She didn't rub it in Brandon's face. She simply went back to work. But this time it was different. She worked her hours, no more, no less. She helped clients, but only during work time. She answered emails, but not at midnight. She did her job, and nothing extra. Brandon, meanwhile, struggled. He tried to adapt to his new role, but the clients didn't trust him anymore. They asked for Margaret. They scheduled calls around her availability. He became what she had been, invisible. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after the meeting, Brandon knocked on Margaret's office door. She looked up. "Hey," he said quietly. "Hey." He stood there, awkward, hands in his pockets. "I just wanted to say." He trailed off. "I didn't know about all the work you were doing. I don't know. I thought it just happened." Margaret looked at him. "It didn't just happen," she said. "I made it happen." Brandon nodded slowly. "I'm sorry," he said. Margaret didn't respond right away. Then she said, "Thank you." He left, and Margaret went back to her work. Not bitter, not broken, just steady. 3 months later, Margaret received a call. It was from a competitor, a larger firm, national reach, better benefits. They'd heard about her. They wanted to offer her a position, Director of Client Strategy, double her current salary. Margaret listened. She thanked them. She said she'd think about it. That night, she sat in her apartment with a cup of tea. This time, she actually drank it and thought about the last 17 years. About the lunches where no one saved her a seat. About the meetings where no one saw her. About the months she spent invisible. And then she thought about the last 3 months. About the clients who came back. About the emails that demanded her return. About Brandon's apology. About David's quiet shame. She thought about all of it, and then she made her decision. The next morning, she walked into David Hammond's office. "I'm giving my notice," she said. David looked up, stunned. "What?" 2 weeks, Margaret said calmly. "I've accepted a position elsewhere." David stood. "Margaret, wait. We can talk about this." "We can." "You had 17 years to talk about it," Margaret said. She wasn't angry, just clear. "I'm done being the person no one sees until they need her." She turned and walked out. 2 weeks later, on her last day, the office threw her a farewell lunch. This time, they saved her a seat. Right in the middle. People gave speeches, said kind things, told her she'd be missed. Margaret smiled, said thank you, and left. As she walked out of the building for the last time, she didn't look back. She got into her car, started the engine, and drove toward something new. Not because she wanted revenge, but because she finally knew her worth, and she refused to settle for anything less. Margaret never spoke to anyone at Hammond and Price again. But 6 months later, she heard through a former coworker that the company had lost 4 more major clients. That Brandon had been let go. That David Hammond had quietly stepped down. She didn't celebrate. She didn't feel vindicated. She just kept moving forward. Because the truth is, some people don't realize what they had until it's gone. And by then, it's too late. What would you have done in Margaret's position? Stayed and fought or walked away? The end.